Welcome. My name is Dr. Melinda Moore. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Eastern Kentucky University, where we're recording this co-branded National Action Alliance Faith Communities Task Force webinar today. It's called Responding to Suicide, a Skills-Based Approach, and it's being done in honor of the National Weekend of Prayer for Faith, Hope, and Life that's occurring May 14th through 16th, 2021. But something that we will also honor throughout the year. So welcome today. The National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention is at the EDC and is supported by a grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, Center for Mental Health Services. The views, opinions, and content expressed are the views of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official position of SAMHSA or HHS. As I said, I'm Dr. Melinda Moore. I am the private sector co-lead of the Action Alliance Faith Communities Task Force. And I am really happy to be here today with two of my colleagues who are also very involved and engaged in suicide prevention nationally, and also Catholic leaders. The objectives of this training are really to learn how Catholic faith leaders are addressing suicide in their communities of faith. Also to discover how Catholic faith leaders can minister to the needs of those who are struggling with suicide at any age, and what can be done for those who are bereaved by suicide. We're also going to learn more about how to integrate the Action Alliance's National Weekend of Prayer for Faith, Hope, Life into their efforts to help communities wherever they pray. The National Weekend of Prayer is an annual event during which all faith communities around the country pledge to join in prayer for those who have been touched by suicide, those who are dealing with mental health concerns and feelings of hopelessness, and for the people who love and care for them. We encourage you to pledge to participate and encourage others to pledge too. It's important to participate and plan how you incorporate the National Weekend of Prayer into your regular services. We also would really appreciate it if you would promote it. Let your members know about the National Weekend of Prayer. I am deeply grateful to be joined by colleagues Deacon Ed Schoener and Dr. Chris Miller today. Deacon Ed Schoener is he's a deacon who serves at the St. Peter's Cathedral in the Diocese of Scranton. Deacon Schoener is a founding member of the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers. He recently published with Bishop John Dolan 2 books on responding to suicide for a Catholic audience. Welcome, Deacon Ed Schoener.
Hi, Melinda, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. Yes, we recently, Bishop John Dolan and I, and you are a contributor to these books also, as well as Chris, who will be coming on after me discussing this important topic. We wrote these books because after my daughter Katie died by suicide, and I'll get into that in a minute, that terrible experience. But after Katie died, I was searching, like many people who've lost someone to suicide, searching for authoritative documents and writings about suicide and what the church teaches about suicide, and I was having a hard time finding something pulled into one place. So Bishop Dolan and I got together and we edited this book. We've contributed a couple chapters ourselves, and also got leaders from the church from around the country, Cardinal Gregory, Archbishop Cordileone from San Francisco, and other Catholic leaders to contribute to these books, so that there would be an authoritative document out there that Catholic leaders, clergy, could look to when they are ministering to people that have lost someone to suicide, and also doing mental health and suicide prevention work. So we actually wrote 2 books. One is a pastoral handbook for Catholic leaders, which gets into some of the details of the history of church teaching and liturgical considerations, preaching considerations. It's a little bit bigger book. And then a smaller book, which is that you can give to someone who's lost someone to suicide. It's 9 chapters written like a novena, and as when someone is mourning and grieving the death of someone, you can only take things in small pieces. So each chapter is a standalone chapter reflecting on the loss of someone to suicide. And at the end of each chapter, there were prayers to the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and Mary. And you can sort of just sit there with the stories and the prayers and grieve the loss of your loved one, and ask the Holy Spirit to guide you and come into a deeper understanding and acceptance and integrate the loss into your life. So that's why we wrote those two books. This session, our webinar, I know is primarily for people, Catholic leaders, and so I'll get into a little bit about why we wrote this book, Offering Hope and Healing After Suicide. And one of the things that I have since found, and was even my personal experience, and certainly many other people have experienced this, people are oftentimes, all too often, reluctant to talk to church leaders after they've lost someone to suicide. And there's three disheartening concerns that we've experienced. The first one is the doubt that clergy and other church leaders understand the experience of suicide, whether it's something that they're comfortable and knowledgeable to be able to talk about. The second concern is that the fear that the church teaches that their loved one is probably in hell. And I'll get into that a little bit. And then the third concern is that they see nowhere, at least evident, to find support in the church after they've lost someone to suicide, and understanding is about mental health and mental illnesses, because so often someone who has died from suicide had also an associated mental health or mental illness concern. So these are three disheartening concerns that need to change, and we think will change over time, and I think there's even some indication that they are starting to change already. So I'll go through each one of them briefly here so we can get an understanding of what the concerns are. So one, an understanding of suicide. Catholic leaders, clergy need to understand that suicide is not some sort of extraordinarily rare event. It is, in fact, the 10th leading cause of death in the country. And the statistic is about 1.6, approaching maybe 2% of all the deaths in the country are suicide deaths. So anybody in a leadership position who's working at funerals on that, you're going to encounter suicide deaths fairly regularly. It's not something that's going to happen once every 20 years. It's going to be an occurrence that you need to be prepared to deal with. Over 48,000 suicide deaths per year. And Chris will talk a little bit about this more later on, but it's particular for younger people. 15,000 per year die. And if today is a typical day in the United States, based on previous statistics, about 130 people are going to die today from suicide. So we hold them in our prayers today. And the coronavirus pandemic, of course, there's a concern that isolation may be adding to that, although the statistics are not in on that yet. But it is a fierce suffering that cries out for the presence of Christ, his church, and its ministers. People are grieving. People are looking for where Christ is in the midst of this suffering. And those of us that are in leadership positions in the church, clergy, need to bring the presence of Christ into the lives of people who are experiencing this suffering. One of the things those of us in leadership positions need to do is not be afraid to tell our stories of interacting with mental illness, interacting with suicide, both within our own families, and being quite open about it. For far too many years, those of us in clergy have been reluctant to talk about this out of the concern that people will see us as weak or having problems, or the general stigma that goes with mental health, mental illness, and suicide. We've been very reluctant to talk about it. So one of the things we do in the book is we do have Catholic leaders talk about their experiences. Bishop Dolan, a number of suicides in his family. Monsignor Pope, who's a well-known Catholic blogger, talks about his experience. Letitia Adams, another writer, talks about her son's suicide death. And I talk about quite openly about my daughter Katie's death by suicide that occurred in August of 2016. And God can turn everything to the good. When Katie died, she had bipolar disorder for about 11 years. She lived with it, and eventually the medicine stopped working, and as she died by suicide at a time when the despair obviously just overcame her, and she died. But after she died, in fact, immediately that night after she died, I was sitting here in this office where I'm speaking to you from, and just a couple hours after her death, wrote her obituary. My wife was wondering how I could possibly do that, and will, until the day I die, be convinced that the Holy Spirit had some hand in this obituary. But I talked openly about Katie's mental illness, her death by suicide, and my intent was simply to let my parish and my community here in Scranton know about this, so there wouldn't be any gossiping or anything like that about what happened. I just wanted to be clear and open. But her suicide, much to our amazement, went viral, was covered in the Washington Post and in papers around the country and even around the world because of what it said. It certainly wasn't anything planned on my part. But I always like to read this obituary. I think it's a good explanation of, I've since come to understand, it's a good explanation of what people deal with. So this is what we said about Katie after her death by suicide. She died. She fought bipolar disorder since 2005, and she finally lost the battle on August 3rd, 2016. And we wrote, so often people who have a mental illness are known as their illness. People say that she's bipolar or he is schizophrenic. Over the coming days, as you talk to people about this, please do not use that phrase. People who have cancer are not cancer. Those with diabetes are not diabetes. Katie was not bipolar. She had an illness called bipolar disorder. Katie herself was a beautiful child of God. The way we talk about people and their illnesses affects the people themselves and how we treat the illness. In the case of mental illness, there is so much fear, ignorance, and hurtful attitudes that the people who suffer from mental illness needlessly suffer further. Our society does not provide the resources that are needed to adequately understand and treat mental illness. In Katie's case, she had the best medical care available. She always took the cocktail of medicines that she was prescribed, and she did her best to be healthy and manage this illness. And yet, that was not enough. Someday, a cure will be found, but until then, we need to support and be compassionate to those with a mental illness every bit as much as we support those who suffer from cancer, heart disease, or any other illness. Please know that Katie was a sweet, wonderful person that loved life, the people around her, and Jesus Christ. So that was the obituary, and even a couple years later, I still get choked up every time I read it. But I think Catholic leaders, and this obituary taught me that, is we need to be open about this. We need to talk about it in our families and in our parishes and reassure people that there's an understanding of suicide. The other concern I mentioned is that people are concerned the church teaches that our loved one is in hell, and we need to improve our pastoral practices. But a brief history is that suicide in the Bible is, there are a couple occurrences of suicide. There's no explicit teaching in Scripture about suicide, although the fifth commandment does say, thou shalt not kill. But gradually over time, particularly in the early days of Christianity, there was this cult of martyrs. And there were people, particularly in the 3rd, 4th century, were actually looking to have people kill them, and almost was a suicide by cop. You might hear that term these days, but they were looking to have the authorities kill them so that they would be murdered. And there also was, at the time in the Roman Empire, a whole honor cult of dying by suicide. If you lost a battle or something shameful happened, it was quite considered honorable in some circumstances to kill yourselves. So St. Augustine came out very clearly, wrote quite a bit about how suicide is a grave matter and you should not kill yourself. It's a dishonor to God. It's a dishonor to yourself. And St. Thomas Aquinas throughout the Middle Ages built on that and expanded on that to the point that throughout the Middle Ages and even up until as late as 1917 in the Catholic Code of Canon Law, if your loved one died by suicide, they were not given a Catholic funeral. They were not buried in a Catholic cemetery. It was viewed as a deliberate act of the will and something that should not be respected and not get a proper burial. They didn't want to create scandal. It was at best a very crude form of suicide prevention. But I know even within my lifetime, I know of people that have experienced the consequences of that. Fortunately, that has changed. In the Catechism that was issued in 1992 and promulgated by now Saint Pope John Paul II, the Church's teaching has incorporated a better understanding of psychology, and that virtually all suicides are not deliberate acts of the will, but are rooted in psychological factors. So obviously, there under paragraph 2281, you can highlight at the area where it says suicide is contrary to the love of the living God. Suicide is grave matter. Clearly, the church is teaching we should not kill ourselves. But under the next paragraph 2282, the church recognizes the grave psychological disturbances, anguish, or great fear of hardship, suffering, torture can diminish the responsibility of the one, still using the word committing suicide, but the one that dies by suicide. And I take great consolation in the next paragraph that we should not despair of the eternal salvation of persons who have taken their own lives. God can provide the opportunity for repentance, and the church prays for persons who have taken their own lives. So my daughter Katie had a beautiful funeral. The bishop attended it. We prayed for her, and we've since I've been to numerous other funerals of people that have died by suicide, and the church understands. And the bad old days of when they did not given a proper funeral, thankfully, are far behind us. One of the interesting things, this image I wanted to bring up, is about Pope Francis. He's talked occasionally about this image. It's from a church in France, the Basilica Saint Mary in Vézelay, France. And you can see on the top of this column on the left is Judas, kind of a grotesque image of him dying by suicide by hanging. But on the right side of the Capitol, you'll see Christ. That's an image of Christ carrying Judas. And Pope Francis says he keeps this image at his desk. And it's an image of God understanding and loving, no matter certainly the great mercy that he shows to us, even, after Judas betrayed him, but also the image of him carrying Judas, even though Judas himself had died by suicide. So those of us that grieve a suicide, knowing that the church understands this in a more deep way and understands and promotes the mercy of Christ, is a deeply consoling thing, and to understand that our Pope understands this in a deep way and places this image right at his desk. So finding support within the church, there's a need for a sensitive pastoral response. We need to always try as church leaders to consider how we can communicate God's mercy to the families and the other loved ones of a person who's died by suicide. The key word here is we don't need to talk about judgment. That's for God to decide. What we need to do here through our ministries is preach the mercy of God, that God loves those of us that are grieving someone by suicide. We don't need to feel shame or guilt or any of those stigmatizing feelings that come all too often after the death of suicide. We need to preach mercy. One thing, for example, at a funeral is preach hope in the resurrection of Christ. It's not the time to explain the church's teaching on suicide. Maybe in other places that might be a good place to do it. In other homilies on general teaching on suicide, that might be wonderful, or separate parish forums on mental illness and suicide. But at the funeral of someone who has died by suicide, we're grieving. We're in tears. We're in shock, because quite often suicide is sudden and violent. And it's at that point in time that we need to be reassured, as anyone who's grieving needs to be reassured, that the one that they have lost is welcome into the arms of Christ and is being loved by both Christ and his church, and we're all praying for them. Perhaps if the family wants a brief reference to the suicide and the way the person died, that might be acceptable, but I would only do that after first checking with the family and making sure that that's okay with them. If they don't want to talk about the suicide at the funeral, I would let it pass, unless the family does encourage that or want that to happen. After the funeral is a very important time, is what can my parish do to walk the long road with me? So often people who are grieving a suicide feel shame, feel guilt, and they also tend to can isolate themselves because of this. So extra effort into reaching out to them, asking them how they're doing, asking them, do they need to have a discussion or talk, or can you, if you need to come over and visit them. Some of these extra steps are helpful just because, unfortunately, the reality still is the cultural stigma and outright discrimination, I would say, that people who are grieving someone from suicide have to live with. So the church can go a long ways by helping walk on this road with them. And then there are moments too that have a mass of remembrance or other support for people that have lost someone to suicide. This image here on the screen is of Bishop Dolan from San Diego at the Suicide Remembrance Mass that they have once per year in San Diego. And people, you can see a couple there coming up and putting a rose at the altar in remembrance of a loved one that died by suicide. It's a very healing Mass, and there's things like that we in the church can do. One of the things I have put up here is a prayer ritual at the location of a suicide. It's in our book. It's something I learned from Father Charles Ruby, who has a ministry loving outreach to suicide survivors in the Chicago area. In the past, sometimes there was a request to come and have like an exorcism rite at the place of the suicide. That's not helpful. I think what a better thing to do, a more healing thing to do, is to have a prayer service like this at the place of the suicide, where if the family wants, because quite often the suicide takes place within the home, within a bedroom or a backyard, and it needs to be remembered and it needs to be acknowledged. And so we go and we pray. We have a reading from either Luke. These two readings from Luke are examples here about salvation has come to this house, or remembers the resurrection of the dead. A brief reflecting on what the church teaches, and reminding the church teaches that we don't despair their eternal salvation. And then we go to the spot and we bless it and sprinkle it with holy water, and solemnly do that, and then pray the Our Father together, bless it with the sign of the cross, and then pray the closing prayer we pray at all funerals. Eternal rest granted to them, O Lord. And may perpetual light shine upon them. And may your soul and the souls of all the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. This sort of prayerful, solemn prayer at the location of a suicide can be very healing for a family. And then as far as additional outreach and resources to the community, as Melinda mentioned, I and others have founded the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers, where we provide support and to develop a mental health ministry and a suicide support ministry in parishes. We provide financial support. If anyone we would at least like to take money off the table as a reason not to start this type of ministry. We have all sorts of other resources on our webpage. So I would certainly encourage you to go to it, consider starting a ministry, becoming a member of the association. Catholic MHM for mentalhealthministry.org is a good place to go and see what these resources are. And another good ministry, a wonderful ministry within the church, is at the National Catholic Partnership in Disability, the Council on Mental Illness. Chris will be speaking in a second here, is president or chairman of that council. I'm also a member of it, and it provides lots of resources and other support to the Catholic community. There's a document here called a Pastoral Response to Mental Illness. So there's a lot of good resources within the church and this ministry. Mental health support and supporting those who have lost one to suicide is a growing ministry within the church. So I hope many of you would be interested in starting that sort of ministry in your parish, and certainly give me or Chris a call, and we'd be glad to help. And I'll turn it over to you, Chris, now. Thanks.
My name is Chris Miller. I'm currently teaching religious studies at a Catholic high school in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm currently the co-chair of the Council of Mental Illness, which Deacon Ed referred to a little bit ago, a founding member of the Diocese of San Jose Mental Health Ministry Network, member of the California State Mental Health Policy Work Group, and a member of the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention's Faith Communities Task Force. I'm going to take a moment to share with you how I got engaged in this work. I was born and raised in Silicon Valley, and in 2013, I had the opportunity to move across the country to study in a postmaster's program in youth and young adult faith at Boston College. I took a job at a boarding school in Connecticut, teaching theology and serving as a campus minister, dorm parent, and soccer rowing coach. For me, it was a dream job. As the day of my departure from the Silicon Valley arrived and moving cross country loomed, I became increasingly anxious about the experience, but I attributed most of that to the normal nervousness one feels when making significant life changes. Upon arriving in Connecticut for the boarding school job in mid-August, I began to put together a new life, applying for a Connecticut driver's license, furnishing the school-provided studio apartment in the dorm, preparing lesson plans, and setting up the campus ministry office. I was ecstatic to live my dream of serving as a director of campus ministry. The best part of the job was my relationships I was able to develop with the students. There was something remarkable about the energy and authenticity of high school students. The upheaval of the move to Connecticut led me to reflect on who I truly was. As part of my theology teaching position, I was asked to teach sophomore level Catholic theology and senior level New Testament. The first unit of instruction for sophomores focused on the purpose of religion, and I recall teaching a lesson about how belief in God can help people through experiences of tragedies and tough times. There were a few times while preparing lessons where I struggled to understand how God could truly be present during times of suffering. As I was wrapping up my program at Boston College and started in the boarding school world, I was very, very sad to the point of feeling complete despair, and thoughts of suicide kept coming up. I reached a point where I was at such a low place that I was admitted to a psychiatric unit of a local hospital for fear of harming myself. The 6 hours I spent at the Connecticut hospital was a terrifying experience, one I never want to relive. After spending a few hours at the hospital, I was discharged after the doctors recognized I was not in danger of hurting myself, and I spent the night in my room at the dorm room at the school. The next day, I met with the headmaster of the school, who agreed that a 2-week break from the school would be helpful. During the break, I decided with mutual support from the school, it would be best for me not to return to the boarding school, and I flew back to Silicon Valley. It was very challenging to leave the school without saying goodbye or providing closure to the students I worked with and got to know. However, I was able to recover from severe depression, and it took about 5 or 6 months. I realized I had a major depressive episode, which was brought on by the significant life change of moving across the country. Thankfully, through the support of my family and friends, a talk therapist, emotional support groups, a spiritual director, medication, and personal fitness trainer, I was able to recover from the grasp of depression. I got to a point where I was able to function by myself and resume normal activities. And in 2014, made a commitment to do all that I could to support those struggling with mental illness and those that are thoughts of suicide. And so I'm really excited about a lot of the work that I've been engaged in and looking forward to future work. I'm now going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about suicide. Nationally, and suicide, particularly amongst young people. So nationally, suicide is the second leading cause of death for people ages 10 through 34. Between 1975 and 2016, there were more than 85,000 suicides in youth age 10 to 19, with 80% in boys and 20% in girls. Interestingly enough, the rate of suicide peaked in 1993 and has been on the decline until 2007, when again rates started to climb. You can see in the chart here that suicide is the second leading cause of death, as I said, between ages 10 through 34, followed by unintentional injury. Boys aged 15 to 19 continue to take their own lives using firearms at far greater rates than girls, but the rates of hanging and suffocation in girls approach those of boys. In addition, the suicide rate at ages 15 to 19 and 20 to 24 years increased in 2017 to its highest point since 2000, with a recent increase, especially in males in ages 15 to 19 years. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about trying to understand suicide. So it oftentimes is not possible to eliminate, and unfortunately, as much as we try, we are never going to be able to eliminate the risk of suicide, but it is very much possible and very important to reduce the risk of suicide. It's important to recognize that suicide is preventable, In fact, there's a campaign in my home state of California that really focuses on looking at that idea that suicide is preventable. Suicide is complex. Oftentimes the numbers are higher than reported. Suicide does not discriminate. Anyone can be at risk. Although there are certain groups that are at higher risk. I know, especially amongst young people, the LGBTQ plus community tends to have higher rates or risk of suicide. There are risk factors and warning signs, and protective factors, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, can help reduce risk. Suicide is not just a medical problem or mental health problem, and it cannot be viewed this way. It is a public health issue. And I commend all the people that are working on the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention and other efforts that are really looking and understanding that it is a comprehensive issue that we all must look to tackle together. Stigma reduction is critical to reduce suicide risk. And I know there's a number of campaigns that are out there to really try to change the way that we talk about suicide. As Deacon Ed referenced earlier, we want to recognize the person first. And it's important to understand that suicide does not define or should not define a person. And then suicide prevention is everyone's business. So some warning signs, red flags, and while these are general warning signs, red flags, a lot of these are really focused as well on young people. So it's important to recognize when you hear somebody talking about or referencing wanting to die or to kill oneself, to recognize that that is something that we want to take seriously. Looking for ways to die by researching methods online, buying a gun, etc. I know in the suicide world, those are called means, and we want to try to work to reduce those means, but we want to make sure, be aware of any individuals that may be looking for researching ways to die by suicide. Another warning sign is when we hear about people talking about feeling hopeless, not having a reason to live, feeling trapped in unbearable pain. Individuals feel like they're a burden to others or behaving recklessly, acting anxious or agitated, difficulty sleeping. And that's actually an important point, especially amongst adolescents, that there is a good amount of research that has found that sleeping as a change in sleeping behavior or habits can be an indicator of suicidality. One of the things that is mixed in the field, there's some looking at the hypersomnia and insomnia. But the major takeaway is to recognize if there are changes in an adolescent or a young person's sleeping patterns is a big indicator. Showing rage or talking about seeking revenge, extreme mood swings, impulsivity, and withdrawing or isolating. So a lot of these are, it's important to recognize that typically we can see patterns, and unfortunately, sometimes after a suicide, there's some of that survivor guilt of recognizing, oh, I wish I would have paid more attention to that, and that's something that is natural, but we have to recognize that there are times where we may not see these warning signs, but hopefully through education and attendance at these types of events and webinars can help you recognize some of those warning signs. Here are some risk factors. This is not a comprehensive list, as the field is still really doing a good amount of research trying to understand what may create or cause a greater risk for individuals that attempt or die by suicide. But here are kind of two categories, health and historical, which I've combined. So mental health conditions. I know the research has shown that anywhere between 60 to 90% of individuals that die by suicide have some sort of diagnosed mental illness. Serious or chronic physical health conditions, including pain, traumatic brain injury, impulsive or aggressive tendencies, previous suicide attempts, family history of suicide, childhood abuse, neglect, or trauma. That last point is an area where there's a good amount of research that is being done right now and looking at adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, and that's something that we want to be aware of, the things that experiences that happen in young people, especially young in childhood, in infancy and childhood, can really have a significant impact as they grow older, as individuals grow older. Some environmental risk factors, I mentioned this earlier: access to lethal means, including firearms or drugs, prolonged stress such as harassment, bullying, relationship problems, stressful life events such as divorce, financial crisis, loss. And as I shared in my personal story, it was that moving across the country that I just was not prepared for mentally. Contagion or imitation, which is exposure to another person's suicide or too graphic or sensationalized accounts of suicide. I actually, in 2009 to 2011, worked in the Palo Alto community, Palo Alto, California, and there was a cluster of 5 teen suicides in 2009-10. And one of the things that the coalition that came together, Project Safety Net, to really try to take a look at limiting or not limiting, but really working and trying to work with the media to recognize that portrayals and things around the suicide cluster could lead to contagion and increase suicide amongst young people. So it's an important thing to recognize. So protective factors and developmental assets. So protective factors buffer individuals from suicidal thoughts and behavior. Some of those protective factors include effective clinical care for mental, physical, and substance abuse disorders, easy access to a variety of clinical interventions and support for help seeking, family and community support, support from ongoing medical and mental health care relationships, skills in problem solving, conflict resolution, and nonviolent ways of handling disputes, and cultural and religious beliefs that discourage suicide and support instincts for self-preservation. Search Institute's developmental framework. Search Institute is a nonprofit organization based out of Minnesota that has done a significant amount of research, over 50 years of research, in looking at what they call developmental assets, which are 40 research-based positive experiential qualities that influence young people's development, helping them become caring, responsible, productive adults. More recently, the Search Institute has been working on the developmental relationship framework, which consists of 5 elements expressed in specific actions that make relationships powerful in young people's lives. Some of those include, or those 5 areas include: express care or show that the youth matters to you, challenge growth and push the youth to keep getting better, provide support to help youth complete tasks and achieve goals, share power and treat the youth with respect, and expand possibilities and connect the youth with people and places that broaden their world. It's important to recognize that most people tell us in some way. And so, as I referenced earlier, there are warning signs, so to speak. All suicidal ideation and behavior should be taken seriously. A lot of times people who are suicidal don't want to die. They just want the pain to end. I think it's a very key point, especially in work with adolescents where the brain is not fully developed. The research is showing that the brain fully develops in the mid-20s, and especially the prefrontal cortex can be definitely is still growing up until that time. And so especially with young people, is to recognize that what they may see as a specific crisis, oftentimes may not have, young people may not have the ability, just because of the growing brain, to recognize that things that's one issue, and that oftentimes things do and will get better. It's important to recognize that prior to a suicide, 90% of people demonstrate clear warning signs. And I think that the key piece there is trying to look at and identify some of those warning signs. And then 80% of people tell someone in some way. I know in some of the research that I'm doing in my area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, that we've found about a third of individuals leave a suicide note. But this 80%, kind of that gap there, is recognizing that they may not specifically tell somebody, as directly as, individual may not say, I'm going to go and die and kill myself. But in some way that there is, research out there that is showing that there are a good number of people that do tell someone in some way. And so we want to be in the field, want to really try to recognize when somebody may be in distress and wanting to reach out. Anyone can reach out to someone in distress and ask, are you okay? And that's very important. I know that there's a good amount of resources out there, particularly QPR, question, persuade, refer, which is a suicide gatekeeper training. And one of the things in QPR, they really teach us to say, to be upfront and ask, are you okay? Are you, and don't be afraid to say, are you using the word suicide, or are you thinking about killing yourself? But oftentimes the most common response is silence. And so we want to, in supporting working with young people, is to recognize that, we have to be gently persistent and follow up, ask again, be a consistent voice of caring, recognize it's uncomfortable. A good way of starting conversation is, I know this is hard to talk about. Be direct, use the word suicide or killing yourself. So not be afraid of that. There is some individuals out there that have a belief that saying the word suicide or killing yourself is going to put that in someone's brain. And the research has shown that that is not true, that somebody that is suicidal or that has thoughts of suicide, they have already thought about that, and asking somebody directly is not going to put the thought into their head. And then remind them that you care and want to help, which I think is probably the most important piece, is to recognize that there is help and that there is, care, and people are valued. Speaking of valued, it's important to recognize and help people get professional help. In those that are working with youth, I know myself as a Catholic school teacher, or even when I was working as a youth minister, is to recognize your limits, the scope of practice, so to speak. Even though right now I am currently working on a master's degree in clinical psychology, I'm still in training in that, and even prior to that, I didn't have the skills to be able to counsel young people. And so it's important to know that, but it's also important to recognize that treatment works. When people engage in support and treatment, things begin to change. Hopelessness is the strongest contributing factor to suicidal ideation. A large part of crisis intervention and post-crisis counseling aims to restore hope. Some counseling support helps people explore ways to resist urges to self-harm, addresses the factors that lead to suicidal thoughts, and helps create a plan that includes coping strategies to address suicidal thoughts in the event that they reoccur. I'm going to pass this over to a wonderful colleague, Melinda Moore, who is going to share a little bit more about the work that is being done.
Hi there. So just as a reintroduction, I'm Melinda Moore, and as I said, I am part of the Department of Psychology at Eastern Kentucky University. I'm part of the core clinical faculty, and I train our clinical psych doctoral students in how to understand suicide. I actually teach a semester-long course called Understanding Suicide from Assessment to Intervention and Management. Deeply grateful that Eastern Kentucky University has allowed us to really change the paradigm of clinical training by training graduate students in how to understand suicide, but then we also train them to treat suicide, given the new science that we have around suicide and that both Chris and Ed have alluded to in their presentations. To be consistent with my colleagues, I also have a history with suicide. A number of years ago, I was married to a young man who was a doctoral student at Ohio State University. He was getting his PhD in chemistry. And he died by suicide, actually 8 months to the day that we were married. And this really changed my life in the most profound of ways. Not only did it change me career-wise, but it also changed me in terms of sort of my priorities and really understanding things very, very differently. I was a new Catholic at the time, And so I'm not a cradle Catholic. I became a Catholic, but it also strengthened my faith in a very profound way. But it took me a while to really apprehend that. It's sort of a circuitous path to becoming a clinical suicidologist. I was working at the time in public health in Ohio and was actually planning on a career in medicine, but I ended up getting involved in suicide prevention. And then I ended up going to Catholic University of America. I got my PhD in clinical psychology. Deeply grateful to the people at Catholic University of America, Dr. David Jobs in particular, who trained me in suicidology. And then more recently, I have had the pleasure of co-editing with my colleague, Rabbi Dan Roberts, the Suicide Funeral or Memorial Service, honoring their memory, comforting their survivors, which is really a book that's sort of a culmination of all of the hats that I wear in terms of being a survivor, being a Catholic, being a clinician, and then being very interested in this intersection of faith and suicide prevention. Those of us who work in suicidology know that it was founded by Dr. Edwin Schneidman. He is really considered to be the father of contemporary suicidology. And he's the one that coined the phrase, postvention is prevention. Now, Dr. Muller talked about prevention among particularly children and adolescent populations. But when we talk about postvention, we're talking about the work that occurs broadly in the aftermath of a suicide loss. And so I want to talk with you a little bit about the importance of postvention in faith communities. So I think this is a really critical issue and one that we really haven't truly understood until the new science around suicide has emerged. So we now have an understanding based upon the new science. I'm very grateful to be sort of part of the research team that uncovered some of this new way of thinking about suicide exposure and impact. But when we think about the burden of suicide, we're not just thinking about the 48,000 Americans who die by suicide every year, or the fact that it's the second leading cause of death among young people, but we're thinking about a broader range of individuals. We now understand that the people that are most impacted are also part of a larger community of people who are suicide exposed. So when we think about people who knew somebody who died by suicide, like let's say in their neighborhood or in their school or in their church or on their soccer team, those are individuals who would be suicide exposed generally to a death by suicide. Those who are affected by the suicide death are those who have sort of a perception of closeness to the individual who died by suicide. So we see these as nested circles. And then the person who is suicide bereaved, both short and long term, we think about those people being very close to the individual who died by suicide. So no longer do we perceive the people who are most impacted by suicide or the burden of suicide only including first-degree family members or blood relatives, but we're actually looking at a broader range of people who we consider to be survivors of this really tragic cause of death. When we think about the people who fit into those categories, we really are thinking about a broad range of individuals. I mean, the people who, the first responders, the people who find the body, therapists, healthcare providers, community members, people they go to school with, even when we think about fans of celebrities who have died by suicide, those would also be people that would be considered to be suicide exposed. And of course, in close-knit or rural communities, almost everybody in that community would be considered to be suicide exposed. When you have a greater degree of closeness to the individual who dies, then you consider the individual to be affected. And so again, it can be the same subset of individuals along with suicide bereaved short and long term. And the group that really stands out are those people who like work spouses or therapists or people who are friends but are not related by blood or first degree relatives to the individual. So I think when we think about the impact and the burden of suicide, we're thinking about a much broader group of people, not just the individual who died or just the immediate family. When we think about numbers though, we now know, based upon the research that, like I said, I was part of this team at the University of Kentucky led by Dr. Julie Searle, we now know that out of everyone who dies by suicide leaves about 135 individuals exposed. For years, really decades, it was repeated that there were 6 individuals who were impacted. And actually there was no empirical support for this number 6. It wasn't until we came along, we were able to really recognized that about 135 people were exposed to each of these deaths. Now, not everybody's going to have the same degree of impact, however, but when we look at perception of closeness, about 36% of these individuals indicate that they're close or highly close to the person. And again, these are not just first degree relatives, but friends, work spouses, people they go to church with. And so we've got about 48 individuals who consider themselves to be close or highly close. Well, now, why is this a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because we now know that suicide exposure is independently related to depression and anxiety and also suicidal ideation. So we now know that by being exposed and being impacted, feeling close to the individual who dies, you are now at risk, statistically significant risk of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. So in a sense, suicide exposure and impact becomes an independent risk factor to suicide. This is why postvention is so critical. And postvention in faith communities is really critical because when you've had a suicide in your congregation or in your community, people want to understand it, but they, again, are feeling a lot of the internalized stigma, a lot of the shame around this cause of death. So they don't want to ask questions. They don't want to be inappropriate. And they sometimes wonder about these things, in silence. And they themselves then feel the impact of this death and they suffer in silence. But I think faith communities are perfect places to be doing this kind of postvention work. We also know that closeness associated with mental health symptoms are also among the suicide exposed. So when we look at low closeness and high closeness, we see that high closeness is associated with a lot of things that are quite deleterious health outcomes, depression, PTSD, and prolonged grief. So again, this is a very significant problem, but faith communities really provide an opportunity to address the impact of this cause of death. And we know that people would rather turn to their faith leaders, their clergy, their lay faith leaders, to talk with them about such sensitive matters. They'd much rather talk to people like clergy and lay faith leaders than talk to people like me, mental health professionals. So I think faith communities are a perfect place to do this kind of work, not only to address the needs of people perhaps in the congregation who are suffering in silence, but also those who have had the worst happen to them, have had a loved one die by suicide. So the National Action Alliance for Faith Communities Task Force, we have now for a number of years had a campaign and had the Faith, Hope, Life campaign, but we've also had special events throughout the year, one being a recognition of World Suicide Prevention Day, which is in September 10th of every year. And we had the National Weekend of Prayer during this time as well. And then we moved it to May. But during the recognition of World Suicide Prevention Day, my diocese, the Diocese of Lexington, they've been a wonderful partner in the effort to really address this issue from the pulpit. Bishop John Stowe, the Bishop of Lexington, has really been incredibly courageous and been such a leader and such an ally in this effort on the local level. So these are the kinds of things that are possible, when we think about what is appropriate, either, in honor and recognition of these events or in the aftermath of, let's say, a suicide. What can be done? Well, I think, making sure that you talk about this from the pulpit, using these opportunities, such as World Suicide Prevention Day, as an opportunity to talk about the problem of suicide, but also what can we do to help those individuals who are struggling or those individuals who have been left behind in the wake of a suicide? What can the church do? And I think the church can do an awful lot. For instance, this is just an example of an advertisement in the bulletin that honored the National Weekend of Prayer when we still had it in September in 2019. Just having this kind of information, using the right kind of language, not using the word commit, but using die by suicide, having access to resources such as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number, the crisis text line, raising this issue within the faith community, within the written documents, from the pulpit. This is the kind of messaging that we really need to see, in our communities. And these are examples of what can be done, perhaps, in honor of the National Weekend of Prayer or just throughout the year. These are things that you can do throughout the year. Also, the diocesan publication here in Lexington, Crossroads, had a special about what Catholics need to know about preventing suicide. And so they have addressed this also in their publications. They're continuing to address this really important, critical issue. And again, this kind of messaging is life-saving, but it also changes the norm within the community that we can talk about this. This is a problem. This is not a personal failure or a moral failure, or you're not being less of a Christian just because you perhaps have a condition or you are thinking about suicide. But there are resources available, and the church is going to minister to your suffering, whether you are suffering with suicidal ideation or you have suffered in the aftermath of the loss of a loved one to suicide. Father Paul Prabel, who's the rector of Christ the King Cathedral here in Lexington, he's written about it in his bulletin columns. And this is, again, the kind of messaging we need to see more of among faith leaders, or whomever has access and has some sort of a platform upon which they can talk about within these faith communities this really critical issue. I had the opportunity to be a guest on Father Paul and Deacon Tim's parish coffee hour a couple of months ago. Again, these are wonderful opportunities to communicate these messages to a community that really desperately needs this information, because we know that there are people who are suffering who are in the congregation, but also then providing information about resources in the community. This is an example of something that can be done within a parish. This is Church of St. Benedict in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. My colleague and friend, Jean Draughton, who is a parish nurse, she actually has a newsletter and she runs a suicide support group there. And so these are the kinds of things that parishes, that churches can do. They can actually have within the context of the church. They can have support groups, they can have newsletters, they can do a broad range of things, perhaps having, screening days, using these opportunities to screen people in the parish, just changing the conversation and letting people know that it's okay to talk about these, what are considered to be pretty taboo topics. And we have to be able to talk about it, like Chris said, because we have to know, we have to ask the right questions, in order to get valid responses. And that's how we save lives, by changing the norms and asking the right questions and getting at people, who really are suffering and really don't know, who to reach out to, or really don't know sort of what the appropriate, approach is to getting help. I run the Eastern Kentucky University Survivors of Suicide Support Group. Unfortunately, it's not housed at the local Catholic church. It's housed at the First Presbyterian Church. But I'm deeply grateful that the faith community in Richmond has allowed me to house it there, and they've been really gracious about this. But this is a support group that not only, reaches out to the campus community, but also the community at large. And this has really been a wonderful boon to those individuals who are suicide loss survivors in the community. I want to thank you so very much for attending our webinar. And I really encourage you to participate in the National Weekend of Prayer for Faith, Hope, Life. There is so much that can be done within your faith community. I really encourage you to look at our website, the prayfaithhopelife.org. And also just join, visit our website. There's lots of resources for your bulletins, for sermons, for all sorts of advertisements and outreach that you can do, lots of ideas. So I encourage you to look at the website and to join the National Action Alliance for Faith Communities Task Force and various Catholic communities across the country who will be joining us for the National Weekend of Prayer. Thank you so much.